We see on the cross two things. We see our failure, our intolerance for goodness and truth. We see our theologies turned violent, dishonest, desperate. I mean, theology put Jesus on the cross. And at the same time, what we see is God's truthfulness, right? What we see is light shining in the darkness. A revelation that breaks through, changes how we think, changes how we act, changes how we live. So following up on that language of speech act, the cross is God's ultimate speech act. The cross is the deed by which God says what must be said. And so the word of the gospel is the word of Christ crucified for Paul. Where is this theory of atonement in Christian tradition? I told you about Peter Abelard, who develops it in response to Anselm, but he's drawing on plenty of early church sources who emphasize not just the cross, but looking at the cross, contemplating the cross. Setting ourselves on the scene to draw on a Negro spiritual, were you there when they crucified my Lord? Putting us on the scene so that we can reflect on what it means and what it means about us. And how reflecting alters our consciousness. This becomes a very influential theory in the 19th century because of the Enlightenment. Because the Enlightenment makes information, cognition, consciousness central to our self-understanding. Remember Descartes? I think, therefore I am. Remember Kant? I can know my inner world securely. What I can't know is the outer world. I mean, I perceive indications that there is an outer world, but it might be a matrix. It might not be reliable the way my inner noumenal world is reliable. So it took a while for theologians to come to grips with this way of seeing everything, this plausibility structure. And an enormously influential theologian for liberal Protestantism is Friedrich Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher reworked theology in terms of its relevance to human consciousness and human experience. And I'm not commending Schleiermacher as a theologian to follow because he had to cut a lot of corners to do it. But he did help make this theory, and his way of approaching theology helped make this theory influential in liberal Protestantism. The cross's power is its subjective power in changing how we see and how we think, convincing us that we are dependent on a God who made us and who saves us. This polarized Protestants by 1900, into so-called modernists and so-called fundamentalists. And the modernists typically rejected sacrificial atonement theory and prized Abelardian atonement theory, moral influence. Fundamentalists insisted on penal substitutionary atonement. These came to be called subjective atonement theory and objective atonement theory. And to this day, it's a fault line between liberals and conservatives. Although, you'll notice that evangelicals, revivalists from even before this time, were relying on the rhetorical power of the crucifixion to change audiences' hearts. How many messages have you already sat through emphasizing the pain of the cross, the love that's demonstrated in Jesus' determination to die for us, for you, to absorb our abuse, to absorb our darkness, our foolishness. To get that message through right to the end. He loved them to the end. To get that message of love through our hard hearts. I mean, isn't that the last night of Bible camp? And it's meant to penetrate your defenses and help you understand that you are beloved of God and to accept your belovedness. You need to face the cross. So as you can see, even though rhetorically conservative theologies rely on objective theory, conservative evangelism and mission often relies on a subjective appropriation. Now, I gave you some objections to each of the other theories, and you need to hear the objections to this one as well. Why, as Jesus is on the cross, aren't men and women streaming over to the cross? Why is Marc Chagall's picture a figural but not a literal picture? On the cross, he dies nearly alone. You strike the shepherd and the sheep scatter, Jesus says. They don't gather. So is the cross really doing, is the spectacle of the cross really operating the way Jesus describes it as operating in John 3, or this theory describes it as operating? When does that start happening and why? When the cross does become the power of God to salvation for all who believe, when people do begin believing, what's changed? And if something changes after the cross, maybe it's a more complicated picture than just the cross alone. The next one. Salvation becomes the changing of our inner selves, the changing of our psyches. Psychological change. Is salvation really merely psychological? Is our whole problem, is the world's whole problem really an attitude problem? So that changing attitudes would restore fellowship? Remember, Anselm thinks a critical element of our problem isn't our problem with God, it's God's problem with us. And if you pull Abelard's atonement theory on its own, it's as if God doesn't really have a problem with us, except for our problem with him. If our problem is primarily psychological, then is the real crucifixion of the real incarnate Word really necessary? A docetic Jesus who isn't really human but appears to be, who gave the convincing appearance of death on the cross for our sake, would that work? It seems that the appearance would work as well as the reality, because we wouldn't be the wiser and our attitudes would change. And that seems to make the crucifixion, strictly speaking, unnecessary. The gospel could even be fiction, and it would work the same way it would work as nonfiction. All of these objections are getting at whether the underlying picture of sin in this theory is adequate, whether it's deep enough. Anselm's answer back to Abelard is, I don't think you've considered the gravity of sin. I don't think you've got the whole problem in mind when you're crafting your account of the battle plan. It's as if the defeat of Italy is enough to describe the end of World War II. Well, no, Italy wasn't really the whole problem. And finally, if this is just a symbol of love, isn't that kind of a strange symbol of love? Bearing abuse unto death. We would consider that toxic today. Maybe if it's something else, then it's a kind of love that then we see. Maybe a victory, for instance, if it's a victory over the powers of darkness. But if it's nothing but a symbol of love, is it really a symbol of love?